Oh, okay.
Taniera said this is the new thing. So I'm passing around a sign-in sheet.
Are there remote people, like, are there people like remoting into the meeting
No.
on WebEx or anything? Okay. Okay. Sure.
I think it's
Okay, great. And then
yeah. It'd be good for everyone.
well,
But don't feel rushed. Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Can you please make sure to sign in so that the department will reimburse us for that lovely breakfast? And Kate has got the sign-in sheet there. I'm really pleased today that we have Dr. David Martin here to give a presentation. He is the Associate Director for Real-World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. He oversees demonstration projects intended to support the agency's evaluation of real-world evidence and contribute to medical policy development mandated by the 21st Century Cures Act. He's the architect of the open source FDA My Studies app, which was funded by the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Trust Fund. FDA My Studies enables patients to input data that can be linked to electronic health data supporting multi-site clinical trials, pragmatic trials, observational studies, and registries. As a former branch chief, division director, and acting deputy director in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, he led analysis of spontaneous reports, formalized risk management planning, and helped develop the Sentinel system. He also served on detail as the FDA liaison to the European Medical Agency. Prior to joining the FDA, David served in the U.S. Air Force in clinical and applied public health roles as a flight and occupational medicine physician. He was assigned to the 90th Space Wing in the 88th Air Base Wing of the Uniformed Services Health University and the White House Military Office. He is an adjunct professor, assistant professor at the Department of Preventive Medicine and Biostats at the Uniformed Health Services University. He earned his undergraduate degree at the Citadel and his MD at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And he completed occupational and environmental residencies with his MPH at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So he's coming home in a sense. I looked over his slides last night. They're about real-world evidence, and I was impressed by the real-world impact it will have. And I'm really pleased to offer to have David here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Is the microphone working okay? Everybody can hear fine? Okay, great. So yeah, nice to be back, and there, you know, it's a government talk, so you're supposed to get your taxpayer dollars worth, and so I actually have like more slides than I should have, so we can like take votes along the way. If something gets really boring, you know, you just wave, because the major topics obviously are sort of initially legislation, regulatory background, policy, which some of you may find boring, but it's actually what drives the FDA in a lot of its scientific work. Then I go into some of the experience with real-world evidence with safety, kind of from the Sentinel system, sort of high-level experience, and then talk about how that may inform some of our work to potentially increase the use of so-called real-world evidence in questions where you're looking at the effectiveness of products and trying to make regulatory decisions about that. And so along the way, we'll talk a little bit about the My Studies app. We'll talk about the work with Reliance, and you know, give you a sense of sort of where all this is leading. Really quickly, so you really get your tax dollars worth. I have some FDA swag in the back of the room. There are pens. You can't have drug company pens, but you're allowed to have FDA pens. So there's a few back there. I don't know if we have enough for the room. And then anyone who might be interested in future employment at the FDA, or even if like when I was first approached by the FDA and said, why would I want to go there? You may have that same response, but please take a card anyway, because you never know. The card, for years, the FDA hiring has been described as a Byzantine process, but they're really making a concerted effort, both with technology and realignment of staff, and actually know the person who's in charge of this new hiring initiative for the FDA. So the cards have a website, which has an email, which an actual person reads. So, and that actual person is like trying to hire people because it's their primary like metric of success. So, go ahead.
And I could just interrupt for a second. Dr. Martin agreed to stay for an hour afterwards, and we're going to meet up in the Frost room with students. Anyone that's interested, I know some are coming. So.
Great. Yeah. So, okay. So enough with the recruiting, but you know, they don't let me out of actual work for nothing. So I have to add some value for them. So. Okay, so my only real disclosure is that I received the funding for the app, so when I talk about the app and maybe some of the partners, this isn't intended to be an endorsement of specific vendors or anything like that. And obviously, I guess that labels me as a person who believes that mobile technology can be used in the world of epidemiology and for regulated research. You know, why is FDA talking about real-world evidence, and what are the legislative drivers? So, as I mentioned, legislation often drives major initiatives at FDA, and the last piece of legislation signed under the last administration was the 21st Century Cures Act, and it has a lot of provisions, including funding for the NIH and all kinds of other things, but there are various provisions that pertain to FDA. And as you can imagine from the title of the legislation, the broad intent is to attempt to speed the development of promising therapies and bring them to patients sooner. So the Congress told the FDA that we're obligated to establish a program to evaluate the potential use of real-world evidence. And there's a lot of language up there, but basically what it means is if a drug is on the market or a biologic is on the market, then we need to look specifically at how it could be used for what we call supplements. So the quick explanation of that is, and stop me if you've heard all this before and you're bored, but basically, you know, once you've sort of completed all your clinical trials, you file with the FDA what's called a new drug application or a biologics license application, and there's a formal review process, and at the end you get approval, if you get approval, or you get a license if it's a biologic and you get a license. But what happens over the years is there's typically like a primary indication, and there's all kinds of primary other issues, like primary ways that the product is made and all kinds of other issues. And so anytime the company wants to change something, like change the manufacturing process, there's all kinds of quality issues, but also if they want to change the indications, they file what's called a supplemental NDA or a supplemental BLA. So basically, this legislation, this provision focuses on SBLAs, SNDAs, but it also has sort of a provision that we're supposed to sort of tighten up when and why and sort of our guidance for post-approval studies, which chiefly are used for safety issues, but are occasionally used for other purposes. And so the two sort of deliverables out of this legislation are one, at the end of this year, we're supposed to sort of put out a public framework, like a document that describes a framework for our process of evaluation. And then by the end of 2021, we're supposed to actually have guidance for industry that affects, you know, the use of real-world evidence in the regulatory environment for the purposes that I just described. And this is just to mention that both that piece of legislation, and then you may be aware that the FDA is funded both from tax dollars and also user fees. So in that respect, I think it's a bit like the FAA. I think for aviation, I think they also get some user fees, although I could be wrong on that. But the bottom line is there's legislation that cycles through, and most recently the 6th cycle of this legislation, which is called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, also stated that we had to have certain real-world evidence goals, and specifically we needed to initiate demonstration projects to sort of learn more about using real-world evidence ourselves and to build infrastructure for it. So the 21st Century Cures actually talked about like what's a traditional clinical trial. Well, sorry, it left us with the problem of figuring out what is a traditional clinical trial and what is not, but it just sort of said real world evidence is like evidence other than traditional clinical trials. And so, you know, there's obviously no single answer to that. And really at the end of the day, as you would imagine, it's really a spectrum ranging from, you know, what many of you in the room might call a traditional clinical trial and maybe something that's highly pragmatic. But this left us kind of with some definitional issues. Actually, the legislation was actually amended in a later piece of legislation because there was some aspect with how they defined real world evidence. But we eventually got to a point where sort of our working definitions within the Center for Drugs and basically for the framework are just pretty broad, that real world data essentially are data that are collected, you know, from routine healthcare or basically from patient-generated sources. And in the small gray box, obviously you can see everything there, but it's kind of all the usual suspects: claims data, EHRs, claims data, EHRs, and then things that are patient-generated like mobile technology, potentially wearables. So sort of all of this is in the zone as being real-world data. And then real-world evidence is the clinical evidence that basically is derived from an analysis of real-world data. And where this is really relevant to industry is that a lot of people in industry, I would say, felt once this legislation passed that real-world evidence just means observational studies, non-interventional studies of secondary health data. And that's definitely in bounds, but it also includes things like pragmatic trials where there's randomized allocation of treatment. So the Reliance trial is like a perfect example of that, you know, where there's allocation in the real world setting, and that would be considered by FDA under this, you know, sort of initiative as real world evidence. So this is just a reminder, again, talking about like policies. So we talked about law. There's also regulation. I won't really get into that. But then there's also FDA guidance. And this is sort of like a lower tier, which is not necessarily binding, but it's a faster way for the FDA to sort of get scientific guidance out to industry and academics and you know, CROs involved in work. And this is just to let you know that even in the trials world, the so-called traditional trials world, there's plenty of foundation for the use of electronic data in terms of guidance. We've got guidance on electronic source data. We've got guidance on collecting informed consent electronically, which we demonstrated through the app. We've got guidance on basically security and authenticity and integrity of data when it's collected, both in sort of an electronic format in a trial, but also if it's like mobile technology and it's plugging into a trial. So there's a lot of guidance already out there, and obviously we'll be building on that. So, you know, sometimes people say, well, you know, what are the goals? You know, I think the drivers of this is that people would like to increase the diversity of populations available for study. People would like to improve efficiencies. We know that there's a lot of data that are collected in the so-called real world of healthcare, and that over time we think this will get better and better. And so some of this is future oriented. You know, some things may not look very feasible today, but may look very feasible a decade from now. But because establishing policy can be slow, we kind of got to get started now. So the key kicker in all of this is that we were also told to maintain current evidentiary standards. So the bottom line on this is that the legal standard for approval of the SNDA or BLA doesn't change because maybe at some point in the future, instead of a pivotal RCT that's so-called traditional, is now replaced by like a pivotal real-world data study. It basically means we've got to have the same standard. So there's all these kind of benchmarks that I would call benchmarks that, you know, have grown up over the years with the RCT regime that we really sort of helped industrialize starting in the 1960s. I mean, you can kind of trace the beginnings of evidence-based medicine back actually to legislation, Kefauver-Harris amendments, that actually forced the FDA to do trials for effectiveness. Because before the 60s, the FDA only looked at safety. It didn't look at effectiveness. So the bottom line is, you know, we were a piece of the start of evidence-based medicine. And these are some of the routine practices that we have. And so, you know, on the real world evidence side, there's I will touch on regs for just a second. In regulation, we have what's called adequate and well-controlled studies. And this is not a clear FDA comment, what I'm about to say. This is me personally speaking. There are different opinions about this in the FDA, and it's currently under legal review with the Office of the Chief Counsel. But if you look at the adequate and well-controlled study sort of standards or dimensions, it actually, as I read it and many others read it and have advocated for internally, it enables you to have non-interventional designs. And it does open that door to secondary use of electronic health data, non-interventional designs. But the bottom line is, so that kicks off a whole other angle of like, okay, well, there's this whole regime of trials, including audits and all kinds of things like that to make sure that data have integrity. And while the way this may look in the real world evidence world may not look exactly the same, there'll be needs for similar features. So, it's not like those kind of dimensions completely go away, or FDA's thoughts about those issues completely go away. So I think what this may lead to is that a large amount of the non-interventional work in particular, but even sort of pragmatic trials that are done for FDA purposes may have sort of different standards and increased oversight relative to maybe pragmatic trials that are done for health services research, or a payer wanting to do a trial to figure out what treatment it wants to pay for or something, or someone doing observational study for other purposes. So just give you that, it's just some background. So the current state of experience at FDA with real world data and real world evidence is that we have a lot of experience dealing with secondary, particularly claims data, to generate evidence about safety. And that's what the Sentinel system was all about. But even before the Sentinel system was started, that was what our old post-marketing commitments and requirements to manufacturers used to be typically driven by. We've had some more limited use of real-world data in efficacy determinations, often as historical controls for trials, typically in rare diseases and cancers. Just a couple examples, so very quickly I'll just go through safety and say, going back to some legislation, the big driver for sort of modernizing safety was the 2007 FDA Amendments Act. And that also was like sort of late in the administration prior to that, and it was sort of signed late in 2007, and then it kind of, a lot of planning happened in 2008, and then things began in earnest in 2009. And I got to FDA in 2009, and effectively not a lot had happened with this yet. And it was funny because I just kind of walked in as a practicing physician and thought, man, I thought we could always do this stuff, that was here, and so it was kind of perfect for me because, whoops, I just turned off the monitor. It was kind of perfect for me because I ended up sort of basically, sorry, I caused a big problem. I ended up basically getting to come in and sort of be part of what I thought I would have been part of, and that was wonderful. And
We'll keep talking.
so yeah, so I'll keep talking.
Yeah.
Okay, there's back. Yeah.
Good job.
Okay, so I've proven that I can turn a monitor on and off. So it's like that's a core competency for working at the FDA. So anyway, but this, believe it or not, before this piece of legislation, we actually couldn't force manufacturers to do post-marketing studies for safety issues. We could only request them as something called a post-marketing commitment. And so, of course, I came in and was like, PMR, and people were like, wow. And I was like, well, isn't that our job? So anyway, but anyway, that was a good thing. And it also, there was also this concept that the manufacturer owned the label. And so labeling changes were always like a pure negotiation. But now, post-FDAA, 2007, if it's a safety issue, we can just direct that it goes into the label described as we want it described. And there were some other issues with this, but it mentioned something called an active post-market risk identification analysis system. It basically told the FDA that we had to have, I won't get the numbers right, but something like, it was like 100 million people by like 20, I don't know, 12 or something, and like 200 million people by like 2014, theoretically under observation by the FDA at any given time. And of course, if you were looking to assemble those kind of numbers back in the early 2000 teens, the only place you could go in the US was claims data. So we went to claims data with our partners at Harvard Pilgrim, and that became known as the Sentinel system. And one other provision of the legislation is that the FDA is actually supposed to bear the cost of doing all these studies. So it's essentially a potential massive offloading of costs and resources from industry to the FDA, and really ultimately there needed to be some kind of balance because the FDA did not receive like additional budget for this. It just sort of told like just do this. So so the sort of there's various types of calibration that have happened with this system, but one piece of the calibration is that we defined the active risk identification and analysis system as so in the Sentinel system, and I should back up and just tell you that the Sentinel system basically uses something like 17 major health plans in the United States who all ETL their data into a common data model that was designed by FDA and Sentinel, and they all agree to do that. And so on a regular basis, essentially typically quarterly, they're doing this with their data. So at any given time, FDA always can query data that are in the same data model. And that means that we can have one set of analytic tools which are SaaS-based and which are reusable. So the group at Harvard Pilgrim, this is in the population medicine department, they fire off these queries like simultaneously. So the FDA parameterizes the queries, but they operationally push it out and the data go to Harvard. And that was partially political because people didn't want, nobody wanted a giant non-distributed database sitting at the FDA, and B, nobody really loves it when FDA employees are like reading individual Americans' like, health data basically. So, so bottom line is, this is how we've defined ARIA. So my point in bringing this up, and why does this relate to real world evidence, is just we've had a lot of experience with claims and in safety. And the question is like sort of, how often does this sort of help us get to where we think we need to go? Now, the evidence standards with safety are often different than the substantial evidence that I was talking about for approval. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that whenever you have a safety issue, there's always in a sense of urgency. So this is me just giving you sort of like colloquially like why this is. The second issue is that with safety, I would argue the glass is always half full. You typically start with very imperfect information, and you're looking to build information both rapidly, like I said, because the product's on the market and people are being exposed, and the longer your decision cycle is, if there's really a problem, the more people are impacted. But the second piece of this is, basically that often these safety issues start with things that are sort of what you might call low quality, a cluster of adverse event reports discovered in MedWatch or VAERS, maybe with a data mining algorithm that we use. And so there's disproportionality, and then there's clinical review, and then it's like, okay, we need more information. And so the bottom line is like, while the standards are a little different, this just gives you a sense of when we're thinking about using ARIA, these are our criteria, which you've sort of had a chance to read while I've been talking about this. And the bottom line is with we did a 2-year review of ARIA. And I didn't personally do this. One of my friends who we ran a division together for several years in CBER, he runs Sentinel. And basically, as you can see there, in the first 2 years of ARIA, about half of drug adverse event pairs, we found ARIA to be sufficient for what we needed from a regulatory and clinical standpoint, and about half it wasn't sufficient. So again, just letting you know, like it's secondary use of electronic claims obviously are not going to get us where we need to go on the efficacy side either 100%. So these are just some of the reasons that drug AE pairs weren't sufficient. And eventually, there is going to be an FDA publication led by Michael Wynn, who actually really ran this thing and gave me the data. So this is just a mention. We definitely don't have time. This is just some listings of some rare disease approvals. So now I'm stepping away from safety. I'm going back to what I was talking about with NDAs and BLAs. And these are actually original NDAs and BLAs. So getting a product approved in the first place, and there have been uses of historical controls where the historical control effectively has been a real world population of some kind. And again, that's typically in the rare disease or oncology situation. It's because you sort of have a monotonic disease progression that's typically, unfortunately, in a negative direction that's observable during the study period. And also often you do unfortunately have hard outcomes related to survival or death, and so, and then also on the rare disease side, you often have issues just with pure feasibility, where you can just say, like, there's no other way to do this trial. So there's some experience there. And then most recently, CBER, actually, the Center for Biologics. So again, just to give you a very high level view of FDA, there's 3 major medical product centers. Center for Drugs, which actually regulates drugs and biologics, and ironically more biologics than CBER. The Center for Biologics, which regulates vaccines, blood components, blood-derived products, and a bunch of other things, including regenerative medicine and some other things are now in CBER. And ironically, there's a number of devices that are regulated in CBER that have to do with a lot of it is like blood banking devices. And then CDRH is the Center for Devices. And I will mention that all this stuff I've been talking about, the provisions of 21st century cures, the evidence standards I've been talking about, they all pertain to drugs and biologics. Devices is its own world. It's got different standards for, they don't even call it approval. But that's, well, I'm not even talking about that. But just letting you know, it's its own thing. So whenever you see RWE guidance out of CDRH, there's a whole other set of considerations there. And one thing I'll say is that there's a good bit of RWE use in CDRH, especially with things like implanted devices, for instance, where you can't really create like an RCT for implanted devices, things like that. So, but anyway, CBER has recently labeled, a secondary EHR and claims-based data study related to vaccine effectiveness for Zostavax. It's not so much that the indication changed, it's just that they labeled it and they put the information in the same place where we put clinical trial information, which is section 14 of the label. So, this is kind of the crux of the issue. When you're talking about any kind of regulatory question, and you're talking about traditional trials, you still have all these issues and questions over here on the side before you even think about using real-world data as a data source. And so now, of course, you've got real-world data, and as I was already mentioning, you've got these issues that, it can't be sort of like, I have said this publicly, like, you're not going to be able to sort of come to FDA having done analyses that are completely non-transparent to the agency and just sort of, I call it like a drive-by study report. You can't just like pull up in the front entrance by the flagpole and just dump this study report out and say, here you go, our drug looks great. And it's not going to happen that way. There's going to be some of these things on the side here. So anyway, the last thing I'll mention is, why claims in EHR aren't going to necessarily be sufficient, why we do need to think about things like mobile technologies approaching patients, things like pragmatic trials like Reliance, where they're specifically communicating with patients by telephone, things like that, is because, you can look at, this is sort of the distribution of endpoints in trials, and there's a lot of things here, like in claims, you can get sort of clinical events and signs sometimes, or you may not, I should say many times you can get them. And it depends on what you're really looking for. But you can't get patient-reported outcomes. And there actually are a lot of patient-reported outcomes or clinician-reported outcomes that are collected in standardized fashions in trials. And you need to have a way to do that, potentially, if you want to go at that zone of things. Or else that zone of things will always be in traditional trials. And then there are some intriguing things, like actually a 6-minute walk can actually be done with mobile technology, things like that. But there's issues where you can start to dig into some of this stuff with EHR data. But also, like we've got imaging here. Most recently, we had a whole issue where there was a whole pragmatic trial proposed to us. They had access to essentially like text where physicians are commenting on the imaging, but there was no ability to get the images themselves. And so that caused a problem for this particular study because it was an area where the classification of the images is an active area that FDA oversees when it does trials. So, we've got doctors at FDA, and, we actually look at things. So, so that didn't meet their needs. So, again, this is just underscoring the whole EHR thing, but I guess one thing to mention is, we talked about the potential advantages of a more complete picture. Again, I'm going to try not to talk about things in this talk that you guys already just know a ton about anyway, but I don't know how this got changed, but actually my boss made this slide, and she actually originally wrote, typing does not equal consistency in complete documentation. So, when you look at EHR data, not that you produced yourself, because the stuff you produce yourself is always great, but other doctors, they're copying and pasting. You can hardly read their note. No, I'm just kidding, but but I'm not. But anyway, it's it can be hard. Some EHR notes can honestly be harder to read because of the way these templates go in. And anyway, I won't dwell on this, but it can be a challenge. And again, there's the other challenge of, especially with labs, there's all this local standardization. So, not only do you have to think about getting data structured, you got to figure out getting it standardized somehow for your study, for your ultimate submission to FDA, and how you're going to do that. So we already touched on this. We really touched on this too. I mean, some of this is just a long list of slides because after this, these are cleared. You guys can have them. You can look at them later. But this just goes back to what I originally said about there's sort of a spectrum that we perceive of using real-world data within both randomized interventional trials, but also interventional non-randomized settings and non-randomized non-interventional settings. So you can sort of ponder that later. But I think, there's a lot of support at FDA for what they call sort of the low-hanging fruit, which would be over here sort of on this side of things. And then, as you imagine, there's more concern about over here for a number of reasons. So so where do I come in? So my boss is in charge of driving all the policies. She's the head of the Office of Medical Policy, and she reports to the center director, and I report to her, and my job is to support policy development and also to basically make sure we've got a useful set of demonstration projects that answer or help us illuminate some of these key issues. So I think, the main things for us is in the wake of some of these demonstration projects, we would like to expand the quantity, quality, and diversity of real-world data. We also recognize that it's a lot easier to tell people to do things when you're a regulator than to go do those things and make them happen yourself as a study team. So by being directly involved in trials, and that's the privilege of being involved in Reliance, we'll get practical experience with real world, pragmatic trials, observational studies, et cetera. And again, I've already talked about how we have a lot of practical experience more on the safety side, but we need to get this experience as it pertains to the legislation. And then we have another piece, which is assessing the performance of non-interventional designs. Again, you can look at these things later or not, but anyway, just to give you a sense of some of the things that are happening. And this piece actually predated 21st Century Cures. So while we were engaged in the Sentinel system, we said, it would be great if we took all this work that we're doing for Sentinel and we thought about doing other things with it. So I already described what Sentinel is. And over here on the left, you guys saw me talking about ARIA. You may recognize that at the bottom. 2 CBER programs that Mike and I started were PRISM and BloodScan, and they still exist, and they're for vaccines and also for blood products and blood-derived products. But over here, FDA made a policy decision to say, if we interact with patients, so if we go beyond the secondary data, but we're still leveraging secondary data, but if we interact with patients, then we're going to call that FDA Catalyst. And so as one of the first things that was considered an FDA Catalyst was just could we do a really giant pragmatic trial? So, and it had to sort of be non-threatening from a regulatory standpoint. So There's evidence that anticoagulation is sort of underused for people who meet guideline criteria for atrial fibrillation. So bottom line is we set up a trial with 5 major health plans where basically we used claims data to calculate the risk score that pertains, a CHA2DS2-VASc score, which sort of pertains to your risk of stroke if you have atrial fibrillation. And we've done the so-called intervention that's being tested in the randomized trial is basically an appropriate use or safe use intervention of contacting the provider and contacting the patient, asking the patient to talk to the provider, so it's sort of like a health systems type study, but we wanted to just test like on a large scale, could you do this? So we've contacted 40,000 people across those 5 health plans, and this is sort of the design of the study, and for ethical reasons, we're going to ultimately contact everybody eventually, but we're going to look at differences, So, what did we dodge in this? Because of sort of health services research, safe use, we didn't need individual informed consent from these people. And it was also argued that if you sort of mail someone a letter that says, would you like to consent, and then you try to do this intervention, it would just be sort of not optimal. So anyway, so that's like a building block because it shows that these groups working together, but it's not really sufficient for our 21st century cures needs. So now you've heard all this context, so now this would make sense to you, like why would we be interested in Reliance? Well, Reliance are very interested because this is testing 2 different treatments for COPD exacerbations, and one is FDA approved on-label use, roflumilast, and another is azithromycin use off-label. And so this is kind of like a prototypical 21st century cures supplementary, NDA or BLA type situation like I was talking about. And I don't need to tell you about the trial because you're helping to run it, but anyway,
but the other folks don't.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the primary outcomes are all-cause hospitalization, all-cause mortality, and there are ways to get data like potentially secondary data from the EHR. There's a call center calling the patients, and all this data is going to flow into the DCC here at Hopkins. And so as we were talking, we thought, what could Catalyst add to this? And what we could add was claims data linkage. So we're going to, through Catalyst, link Medicare claims so that we can help backstop finding these outcomes. And, because it's certainly possible that, someone could, be getting care for a while in one EMR system that is part of the trial and then leave, one of those trial sites. It's possible that someone could stop answering their phone calls, so this is another way to get outcomes. And, again, most important for us is we're going to be aligned with the trial. I want to express personal appreciation. The Reliance trial is actually bringing some of us from Catalyst onto their executive committee so that we're going to learn about the trial operations as well. So as we're contributing, we're also going to be learning. And this just gives you a sense, some of you do this kind of work. We're going to use enrollment files for all-cause mortality, inpatient claims files for all-cause hospitalizations for the fee-for-service people. There's a new data stream coming out. We don't know yet. Some of you may be more informed on this than me. Part C Medicare Managed Care data stream, very recently sort of announced, and we're not sure how feasible this will be, how timely this will be, but if this is feasible and somewhat timely, we will try to go after this. And then Bob Weiss had the idea of doing Part D medication dispensing data, and we were able, to arrange for that to be done too. So bottom line is that their participants are consenting to randomized treatment allocation in the real world environment, and at the same time, they're consenting to basically people looking at their electronic records. So we hope that people who are willing to not know which drug prescriptions they're going to get are also willing to consent to having people look at their data. So we'll see. That's something we'll pressure test. This is actually just for your reference later. This is like how the linkage is actually going to be done, like a schematic diagram. All right, so now I know I'm sucking up all the time. I don't want to take away all the time for discussion. So this is just the FDA My Studies app. Why do we do this? Because a lot of people have been saying for a year, well, actually, why do we do this? actually I just took a risk like years ago when smartphone penetration was much lower. I still thought I think it's going to grow, and all those holes that I talked about in the data availability with my experience with Sentinel, I just felt like we're going to need this, and so I applied for this grant and got it, and it took a while. It took a long time to get the money. so I think I sort of thought of this in like 2012, and now when I talk about it, people are like, that doesn't sound very novel at all. And so, but then it was pretty novel, and people were challenging me, and I'd be like, smartphone use is like 40% of the population, and they'd be like, well, we don't know if it's going to grow, and now it's higher. More people have smartphones and access to the internet that way than have laptops, and it's like in the high 80s for adults in the U.S. That's from the Pew Charitable Trust. So what do we do? It wasn't, build an app, like that wasn't all that amazing. My kids could have told me that. But essentially, the issue with what I wanted to do was I said, what we need is it's not just an app. We need a secure storage environment, and a secure storage environment that enables you to work with multi-site trials or distributed studies like Sentinel, like PCORNet, like future pragmatic trials. And that storage environment can't just be any old storage environment. You've got to be compliant with FISMA, which is like rules pertaining to security from the federal government, and 21 CFR Part 11, which is our rules for integrity, authenticity of data in clinical trials. And there's just all kinds of issues that come up. You wouldn't believe it. And so the idea is that this thing exists, and we tested it in a group of pregnant women in Kaiser in Seattle, and basically, you've got the storage environment, but the other issue is we didn't make it like a pregnancy app. The app has a configuration portal. So a way of thinking is this is an app sort of optimized for looking at health outcomes after exposures. Ideally, drugs and biologics, but it could really be something else. And then my final thought was, this should be open source when it's done so that other people can make it do what they want it to do. So there's actually never going to be, probably not another FDA My Studies app, like our little app icon. We've already taken it down because we did our pilot study. But the next people using the app are going to brand it their way. And so we're really not going to go over this, but if you want to see some of the details of the contortions you go through when you want to meet those objectives, that's like what the system architecture kind of looks like. And this just gives you a sense of like, this is where you go in as a researcher to kind of configure like the way you want the questions to work, et cetera, et cetera. This is some views of enrollment and consent that we used with the pregnant women. This is actually just kind of interesting that people really did use the app far outside of research clinic type hours. The main time of the day that they weren't really, there was kind of nobody on the app was, no surprise, at kind of like midnight to like 5 a.m. But otherwise people were, on it kind of around the 24-hour period. And we got some qualitative feedback from patients who were like, yeah, that was cool. I could like answer questionnaires while I was in the grocery store line, or while I was like waiting for someone to come meet with me in the office or something. So, so the implications here, you do get some diversity of data that you might not get from the EHR. We had pregnant women telling us sensitive things like, I drink, I smoke, I use illicit drugs while I'm pregnant. We got 13 times more over-the-counter drug exposure than we could get by just looking at the Kaiser dispensing for drugs that are also effectively over-the-counter, but they're being paid for by Kaiser because Kaiser's like an HMO system. And then, no big surprise, they're pregnant women, they're reducing drug use in general. There's a tendency to do that, and they were only using, in a sense, 60% of the drugs that appeared at dispensing. So anyway, it's not all happy though, because kind of like the world of spontaneous reports like MedWatch and VAERS, we also got someone who gave us an erroneous free text medication report. And not only that, it was like she actually like told us about the medication and like why she discontinued it, and it doesn't exist. Like it doesn't have an NDC code. It's not, I tried, I searched high and low. It doesn't exist. So things can happen. So anyway, the the last thing I'll say is that mobile's not a panacea. Most of our money and time went into building this whole system and testing it and the user acceptance testing and things like that. And so by the end, when we tried to run the study, like our outreach was like horrible. It was like, here's a letter to your house. And if you open the letter, it tells you when you download this app, and are you willing to do this? And then on the other side, we just did one phone call. So we had like a mini RCT of outreach. And just one phone call doubled the response rate. And of course, so the bottom line was, I think when you do this kind of stuff, you're doing it to help, but it doesn't change the fact that you need that whole like infrastructure, just like you would in a clinical trial, to actually like recruit and retain people. So, so now I'm going to really fly through this. So this is a registry concerned with inflammatory bowel disease. We're going to give them support with the My Studies app to help them do their registry and an embedded PCORI study. We're also involved with a pragmatic trial of patients with juvenile idiopathic arthritis and looking at early intervention with biologics versus usual care. And it turned out that one of the endpoints is uveitis. That's obviously assessed by ophthalmologists, and the ophthalmologists are not study sites, they're not investigators, they're not part of the trial. And so they want to use the app so that the parents, if the child's young enough, or the child themselves, if they're a little bit older, can actually feed data, back to the study team, on the day of the ophthalmology visit. They have a paper-based system that's their baseline. So if people don't have a smartphone, then they don't have to do it. They can do the paper-based system. So these are just details. So the last part is, my boss made this slide, observational designs for efficacy, sort of. She's witty with pictures. So I go to lots of meetings where people like this person, although he actually hasn't told me this, but I have been told, some really great like pioneers of RCTs and we've had a lot of discussions over the role of non-interventional designs, and obviously I'm kind of glass half full and many of them are glass half empty, and we'll leave it at that. But one interesting convergence I'll mention was I did talk to a guy named Rory Collins, who is a huge RCT advocate, not really a lover of non-interventional designs, but he did point me to some papers that he wrote in the 1980s, actually when the Mac computer came out. In 1984, he's got a paper where he's like talking about how there's all these errors with randomized controlled trials, especially the small ones, and we really need meta-analysis. And so there's some echoes of some of these issues and concerns about RCTs were really being thought about even in the 80s. It's just that nobody was thinking about so-called big data as like a potential kind of workaround for that. They were thinking about meta-analysis. So bottom line is people at FDA like data. So we're going to, we selected 40 RCTs. They've already happened, obviously, and been reported. We're going to attempt to replicate them just using secondary claims data. We've already talked about all those like possible limitations and whatnot, but we have to do high throughput, and so we didn't really have a choice. So we are obviously focusing on ones where you would imagine that we think the data can basically support the attempt to replicate the trial, and we obviously want to see if the ability to replicate the findings varies by therapeutic area or not. Is it all over the place? We don't know. We're engaged in this. We're also going to replicate some ongoing trials, and that'll be a next phase of this. And this is being led by Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and me. This is just like why do people distrust non-interventional designs, and why do transparency matters. We won't dwell on that. But here's just, I'll kind of leave you with this. Like our implementation process is, there's prospective engagement with FDA during protocol development, because essentially we have like a mini simulated review team that's working with the people at the Brigham. And then we are reviewing and concurring with final definitions of cohort identification, exposure, outcome, covariates. And then nobody's looking at the final outcome in terms of differential outcome. But then there's obviously power and propensity score based balance checks, and then we make a joint agency Harvard Medical School go no go decision, And then once that decision happens, we kind of cross the line of departure, and everything in red happens, starting with registering this protocol on clinicaltrials.gov. So you guys are going to be able to, like, inquiring minds will be able to find this, and as we replicate, we're going to start in the diabetes therapeutic area. We're going to probably, as each therapeutic area closes, we're going to be posting our results. And then through this whole process, we have an audit trail, and we actually have access to the data. So at FDA, we're going to be able to like do our own queries, our own sensitivity analyses. So really don't have time. I'm sorry I sucked it all up, but we had to develop, like, you might be interested in this later, like, how do you define agreement? It turns out to be like not super easy, and there's no perfect answer, and people can disagree with this, but the frontline physician, medical reviewers chiefly, and even the statisticians, they sort of said, we want to know we'd make the same decision. And right now they have a frequentist paradigm, and so this is kind of, you'll get a sense of, like, you can look at this little schematic later. We created what we call like regulatory agreement, and then we have what we call estimate agreement. And then later, we also developed a sort of, there's estimate agreement based on the 95% confidence interval, but somebody wanted to know, yeah, but like how close are we? So they wanted to create like inner goalposts, so we have a 70% confidence interval to sort of half the length of that. So last place, where's all this coming together? Actually, as all this is going on, DPARP, who does pulmonary products, sorry, that's a division, sorry to get all wonky on you. But anyway, they actually said, look, we think we may be a place where we're ready for real world evidence, because a lot of our outcomes in trials can actually be parameterized in claims. And so we're actually going to see, and we're going to work with the Reliance team in the future, can we potentially pre-replicate Reliance with claims data? Be very interesting to see. And we're going to do some other observational studies. And so last thing I'll say is, like, where, you know, this is the last slide. Well, where are we going? One is companies are submitting stuff to us, like now. It's been happening. And so we're learning from those submissions. It's challenging, but without their help, we can't get anywhere on the efficacy side. Safety, we could build everything all by ourselves because we have sort of co-equal, you might say, or you know, broader responsibility for safety, but we don't develop products, so we need their help. We're continuing, obviously, the demonstration projects, and then we'll have the framework that I talked about at the end of this year and the guidance at the end of 2021. So that's where it's going. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been really fun. Sure.
I was excited to see that you're using patient self-report as a valid data stream.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the role of photographic images or video in allowing patients to do storytelling of their experiences through that?
I mean, to be honest with you, that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping that people will, for instance, like, see this. So we're actually going to post this code, and there'll be something on the FDA website fairly imminently. There's an American Medical Informatics Association conference next week, and there's going to be, it's been demonstrated in other places, but sort of a, what do you want to call it, like a sort of a fake app that's from the code is, you know, whatever, non-operational apps can be demonstrated, and FDA at that point is going to be, we're going to be, you know, releasing the code and releasing the technical documentation. And so we're hoping that other people with like deeper pockets than us basically will do this kind of things. I mean, that's, but so right now the app can just show video, like a video, you know, it can't do that. But like at the time we were talking about, oh, wouldn't it be great, for instance, if we had like optical character recognition, someone could like take a picture of their medicine bottle or something. So I think there's all kinds of things that could happen with bi-directional communication that's enhanced with images, storytelling, whatever. There's kind of no limit. It's just that there is a limit with us, which is our very constrained resources. And so that's why, you know, it's open source. And I think, you know, people, and then to answer your question more on a policy side, I think, you know, you have to build things before they can be like considered. So, you know, it's sort of, I think, you know, conceptually, there's a whole other work stream at FDA that I'm not directly involved in, where people do patient report outcomes in trials and things like that. So, sorry, maybe not as specific as answer as you were looking for, but
Well, just to add to that, so industry, I come from industry, and,
Yeah.
and we've been doing patient self-report for 20 years. And so there are platforms that have already been developed that are sort of user optimized and gather that data, but they're not kind of FDA or HIPAA compliant.
Got it. Yeah.
And so I think that it's an interesting thing to think about whether it's a partnership.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, but that's where things need to go to be used. Yeah, beyond that specific. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is really related to the agreement and disagreement that you showed the companies.
Oh, sure.
So with the like modern causal inference, methodology, you can sort of try to emulate a clinical trial by using, non-observational or any other type of data, but then you're comparing against the clinical trial results. So,
Yeah.
so my question is really, when you don't have the trial, but you can still emulate and try your best to, sort of have your eligibility criteria and outcome set in the clinical trial format. But then it's really hard to predict when you will have the results close to a real trial and when you will have results, quite different from the trial. So what is your thought on that?
No, I mean, absolutely. Like, I think my thought is that the first thing I got. So, well, if I did nothing, the answer in 2021 or 2031 or 2041 would be. I think I'd still be alive then. I don't know. Would be no. We're never doing this. So I'm really in this sort of challenging situation of trying to offer, like, for causal inference at the end of the day, if everything else is equal in terms of all the other aspects of an adequate, well-controlled study, but one has randomized treatment allocation, there's always going to be someone at the FDA who says, you've got unmeasured confounding, and this is garbage, And the countervailing thing is like, well, okay, but maybe over time, as there's more and more data available, larger samples, I don't need to get into it with you, but like there's ways that we could see this difference getting closer and closer, and maybe to within like an acceptable margin, so that you could still make decisions. And so this is really like the baby step to basically say, well, look, we don't know which way is this going to go, but let's say we replicate like 35 out of 40 or whatever. There's going to be more people willing to listen and think in that direction and continue that discussion than obviously if it's like all over the map. And so you're right. Like there's no answer. Yes.
I just want to build on that. So what's interesting, I love that you're doing these 40 studies because I think that's how we can build a body of evidence about the quality of evidence. So I just want to make a connection because I straddle public health and education and blah, blah, blah. And so in the social and behavioral sciences, they have a whole body of evidence they're building, and I think Cook and others have like 100, they call them within study comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
Where they compare an experimental result to a non-experimental. So now they have like enough that they are writing papers that say like what are the characteristics of a study, and if you're studying math, what, so for example, having a baseline measure of the outcome is like point number one. So I'm really excited to see this world sort of maybe help starting to build a similar body of evidence that can then sort of not just say like, is it good or bad, but what are the scenarios under which we would trust a non-experimental study.
Right, and I alluded to that. Like I said, I mean, my personal thought is that this will probably differ in different therapeutic areas, and will differ according to the types of questions. That we'll be trying to dig into that.
Okay, just go to one slide before that. 47.
Okay.
So what makes that decision of go, no go? That felt worrisome.
Well, so we are chiefly going to be focused on, do we have the same or more power, statistical power in the RWD study as the trial? We don't want to be lower powered than the trial. Believe it or not, sometimes that could happen depending on your exclusion criteria. And then we're going to be digging into, everybody knows that kind of covariate balance through propensity score based methods, when you sort of decide like what do you think is like good balance or not, depending on what method you're using, is kind of an art. I guess so you all might update me today, but it appears to be a bit of an art. And so we're going to be involved in making those decisions. Obviously, when there's like almost no overlap between two populations, people just look at it and go, I look at that, I see that, we shouldn't study that. But those are the chief things that are happening in 3, and we did have one trial just fall out where we couldn't get the power to be as high in the real world data. It's fascinating.
And it feels really important to know about those first 3 steps.
Oh yeah. So when we ultimately report, we'll have sort of like a diagram that shows where things fell out. And so 3 will be like discussed in like our final report. So you'll be able to see like this is the ones we sort of tried to do and couldn't do and why.
One last question.
Oh, I guess we got 2. I could be quick. Yeah. Go ahead.
Could you comment on how good the real world data are in capturing mild or non-specific adverse events?
Yeah, no, I mean, not good. I mean that's actually, going back to Sentinel experience. We tend to get like in claims, you're highly reliant on diagnosis codes, or procedure codes, and so people need to, number one, think their problem was significant enough to actually present for medical care. So if nothing's medically attended, you won't get it in secondary data from the healthcare system. And then not only what you're saying is sort of things that are like mild, but things that are difficult to diagnose are also more complicated versus like acute events. So these are tough things, and I think that's why, again, we're trying to like broaden the sources of data. Is that you have a question?
It's more of a comment. So I have confidence in those causal inference methodologies because look at the pragmatic trial where you are doing simple randomization. I mean, and you are ascertaining the outcomes from EHR data or claims data. I mean, using the high dimensional propensity score, you can match people with perhaps 500 different characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
The treatment group and control group could be more similar than the treatment and control group while you're using a simple randomization. So, I mean, go one step further from your pragmatic trial to pure observational studies. I have confidence in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's another counter argument that people like me have actually advanced behind closed doors. So, yeah. You got the last word.
Well, thank you very much. And as I said, Dr. Martin's going to stick around. We're going to head upstairs in case somebody's coming in here. But you're welcome to come up and ask questions now. I think you left some cards.
Right, yeah. Please take the FDA pens because they're going to rate me on whether or not I came home with any pens. So if I ever come home with none, I did a great job, even if it was terrible. And and then there are, you can surreptitiously take cards if you might want to ever work at the FDA. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I left my email open. That was just the things that we got. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah.
That's great. So you mentioned that the slides will be available?
Yeah, we should be able to give them. She should be able to distribute them because they were clear, so you guys can take a look.
Okay. I just wanted to catch Janet to say that I think we're